I want to use my few minutes to continue the conversation and using, I think, a bit of my own personal experience. And I know that my experience is not unique, because as I see the room and know some of the folks who are here, is I know that your own experience is also what anchors you to inform how you do the work and what you think the work needs to look like and what the work should entail as we look at the issues around having social impact. So I believe fundamentally that the work of immigrant and settlement sector is inextricably linked to social justice imperatives. Therefore, the work we do in the sector will inevitably bump up against social, public policy, and government directions, which often frames, and as you heard from Mario's presentation, and as you heard some of Francisco's rebuttal, frames how we develop programs and services, and also how folks come to enter the system to even access our services. I say this informed by the work that I do and the experience of the clients we serve at the Community Health Center where I work, where access to care for immigrants and refugee communities is one of our priority. Additionally, as I said, from my own personal experience as an immigrant and the child of a mother who came to Canada under what was then called the Caribbean Domestic Worker Scheme, and many of us who are here and who have been around that long know that scheme, and others who may not know it now as the Living Caregiver Program. So when my mother joined this particular scheme, and when I joined her in Canada some 9 years later, I heard her stories of struggle against exploitative workers who then and today continue to treat living caregiver workers as, I would say, their personal slave. My mother had the insight back then in the very early 70s, having arrived in the late 60s. So my mother had the insight to apply for landed status near the end of her contract behind her employer's back. These conditions still remain. She was successful, but not before being taken to small claims court by her employer for the price of the plane fare he had paid for her travel to Toronto, and at the same time, the cost of steak, not steak in the ground, but the steak we eat. But they claiming that she had ate them without his authorization. Again, she had the insight in going to that small claims court confrontation to borrow money from friends, not knowing what would be asked of her. So she took money to court and had the insight to do that, and this enabled her to pay and repay both the plane fare cost and the cost of the steak. My arrival also had similar characteristics. When I came, Shaw and Harvard, went to Central Commerce in the city of Toronto. As our parents, new immigrants, you look to what's the closest school? Yeah? Not what's the best school, because we assume that the schools are all good. So we say, what's the closest school? The closest school was a school that was called Beckford Park Secondary. And for some folks who are here and who were here then, know that Beckford Park at that time was what they called a level 3 school. So it was a school where a large number of immigrant children were streamed into vocational education that led only to college, without opportunities and possibilities for university or postgraduate education. That was the school that my mother took me to. And in the registration process, the guidance counselor asked, so what do you want to do when you finish school? Where do you want to go? And I said, well, you know, I might be interested in law. And he stopped and said, well, this might not be the school for you, because children from Beckford Park do not go on to do law school, and they do not go on to university. I share this because there was also an assumption in some of that conversation as well that he also sought to suggest that maybe Beckford Park is where I should be because of where I was coming from. Again, the assumption was that the education that I had before arrival to Toronto was maybe substandard, and maybe Beckford Park is only the thing that I could manage. Yet there was, I think, a lack of understanding that many of us who arrive from places that have histories of colonization. And that the histories of colonization also they bring the history and the experience of colonial education. So we sometimes come knowing more about verb, grammar, that's linked to the English language than we may know about that of our own native language. And I came knowing more about William's Wordsworth and the poem The Daffodils, yet I have never seen a daffodil. So I share this personal experience to give you, I think, a bit of a window and I think a resonance for what might be with your own story. But I think also the resonance and the stories of the communities of the clients who you see. And I know that my story is not unique. But I think from the story you can see the intersecting sites of inequality that my mother traveled, and for us to remember the similar intersecting sites of inequality that the clients we serve in our agencies live with. In my mother's case, the things that made her vulnerable were she was coming into a government-sanctioned temporary work program which structured her precarious conditions as an immigrant woman. Two, that her immigrant status at the beginning of her arrival was tenuous just by virtue of being in that program. That her gender and working class location and her place in the labor market made her entry into low-income, low-wage sector almost inevitable. And that her race, at that same time, the state was targeting young Black women from the Caribbean, now Filipino women, into the similar program. Hence, these multiple locations and sites of inequality, it is important in our work and practice to support clients seeking to find more stability and moving out of these precarious conditions, that in our work we have, and that in our work we seek to have social impact through our work by supporting clients and as they engage in self-advocacy and community leadership that will bring and have a positive social impact for themselves and the immigrant refugee settlement sector. The community work and mobilizing efforts to maximize social impact for women like my mother at that time produced the term good enough to work, good enough to stay. As we move to look at the changing social conditions of funding, and we look at creating what inevitably might be agencies of the future, and some of the factors, the 10 factors that Mario outlined, you may say in response that taking those kinds of mobilizing actions and having a social justice analysis linked to the service delivery model is too risky a project today, as we're sandwiched between a neoliberal agenda and an increasingly conservative politic that sometimes can seemingly act without impunity against its critics, while claiming to speak for the quote-unquote ordinary Canadian taxpayer. Hence, as we seek to advance what I believe must be a twin social justice and social service agenda, this threat is real, as it has produced what we in the sector call, and have been calling for a long time, the advocacy chill. However, this is the reality of the majority of communities. However, the reality of the many of the communities who come to our door seeking services are, they have issues around income. So relatively low income across the majority of the households we serve. Housing is an issue. Lower housing ownership rates, and folks who are living in and or waiting for subsidized and affordable housing. Employment, A number of the communities we serve are overrepresented in precarious jobs, have difficulty in having their credentials recognized, and experience high, yes, I'll be there, and experience high unemployment. There are issues around education, where we see the challenges of inclusion in our public school system. The experience that I had over 30 years ago still exists in many communities in this city. We see poverty as an issue. Poverty continues in immigrant refugee communities who are overrepresented when we look at the statistics that are produced, whether it be from United Way, from the City of Toronto, and or from the province. We also see that this place has a very ambivalent and sometimes contradictory representation of the people who we serve. So on one hand, they talk about the communities who we serve as economic burdens, yet on the other side, we hear about we are hard workers. On one side, we hear that we add to the rich tapestry of Canada's multiculturalism, yet on the other side, we hear about how sometimes we pose national and security risks. And at the same time, we know that there are social factors and social risks that many of the people who we serve experience: isolation, marginalization, prejudice and prejudicial attitudes, discrimination, and we know presently youth disengagement. So with these conditions, we know that the service needs of immigrants and refugees for transitional shelter, housing, language, employment support, education, health, and social service happens within a context of all the issues that are socioeconomic. Therefore, it would be futile for us to focus solely on education and employment and training without speaking to the lack of good jobs and the presence of discrimination and bias, which keeps immigrants and refugees away from accessing good jobs or receiving respect and recognition in their workplace and communities. I'm coming close to the end. From a public policy interest, our funders should see it as reasonable that we would advocate for our clients to get good jobs, to have access to employment protection, access to primary care, and that women in our programs have access to childcare and social supports, and that we would seek to challenge and remove barriers that impede the stabilization and inclusion of these communities we serve. Because when we fail our clients, and our clients do not succeed, the funders, I would suggest, lose the return on that investment that they've made through the funding that they've provided. And as well, they disable the communities who we serve from becoming those quote-unquote ordinary Canadian taxpayers that they suggest they would want them to become. Therefore, it would be mean-spirited and contradictory to vilify organizations and communities of people working for inclusion with a desire to have social impact. The strength for the future of our sector, I believe, will come from collaboration and networks across communities and the deliberate intersectional analysis that links issues of race, gender, immigrant status, disability, class, age, income, education, geography, sexuality, etc., etc., etc. The challenges facing the immigrant settlement sector is connected to what is happening in organizations of work through the creation of more contract and precarious employment conditions. The attacks against unions and unionization should be our concern as a sector because we know that there is a union advantage to those who have been marginalized in the workforce. Finally, I would also suggest that the strengthening the future must include mindfulness about how we build alliances. And I think as immigrants and people who come here after First Peoples, that I think we must be mindful of the need for alliance with Aboriginal communities who have some of the worst outcomes when you look across all the broad determinants of health. And we need to be vigilant, I think, not to allow our successes and advances as immigrants to be used to diminish the struggles of First Peoples in this country. And we hear the stories in our communities, because we're all feeling impoverished and we're all feeling pressured, where we will say, well, we have done it, why can't they do it? Yeah, and we came after. And I think there's a way that sometimes we get modeled as the folks who can come and pull ourselves up against the folks who are here who have not been able to do that. And I think we need to be mindful. Therefore, we too must remember that there is no justice in creating equity for some and leaving inequality in the path of others. Thank you.